Good evening and welcome everyone to the 2020 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, also known throughout the internet as the VGBF. I am Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and we're so happy to have you with us today. We wish you could be here in person, but we're still super excited to have you with us virtually. Before we jump into tonight's event, we please ask you to please do three things for us. First, like this video. Second, comment below to let us know where you're watching us from. And third, hit the subscribe bell so that you can get notifications about all of our upcoming presentations. Undoubtedly, you're going to have questions during this presentation. Please write them in the chat section. Most, if not all of them, will be sent along to the author and she will answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, we encourage you to support today's featured author by purchasing her book through independent bookseller and festival partner, Politics and Prose. Finally, a big thank you goes out to VGBF's featured sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight, we have got author Casey Cep here to talk about her best-selling book, Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. Furious Hours beautifully tells a true story of murder, revenge, and courtroom drama. Beloved writer Harper Lee spent years working on telling this story. Now, Casey Cep brings the story to life, from the shocking murders to the courtroom drama to the racial politics of the Deep South. Casey Cep is a staff writer at the New Yorker. After graduating from Harvard College with a degree in English, she earned a Master of Philosophy and Theology at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Furious Hours is her first book. Interviewing Casey tonight is Eugene L. Meyer. Gene is an award-winning veteran journalist with an eclectic passion for history, varying lifestyles, travel, real estate, and the Chesapeake Bay. He has been widely published in several magazines, authored 3 books, and was for many years a reporter and editor at the Washington Post. Since departing the Post in 2004, Meyer has garnered 15 awards for his work and has had more than 50 bylines in the New York Times. Welcome to the program, Casey and Gene.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Phil. Casey, it's good to see you virtually.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gene. I know we're going to have a great conversation.
Well, I love your book, and I just tore through it. It was a page turner. And I was just fascinated by the research that you did and how you put it all together. And I guess my first question is, it's a remarkable story of the, I guess, 5 or 6 alleged murders that occurred, allegedly at the hands of this minister in Mississippi. And then the white lawyer who successfully defended him, and then defended the man who actually killed him, one of the relatives of the deceased. Finally, Harper Lee and her valiant but ultimately unsuccessful effort to turn the story into a book. So my first question is, how did you find the story, or did the story find you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I always love to talk about the origins of the book. And I guess just to start off, though, it is true that this book looks at 3 very different lives and people who have different genders and different races, and who have basically one thing in common, which is how they met, at this intersection, at this courthouse, in this particular trial. But what I love about the book is it gave me the chance to think about what brought them all to that place. And it's a perfectly fine time. I think, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge what's happening all around the country, and the ways that people are starting to think about the lives of others, and how important it is to think about the way that Black lives are particularly imperiled, and about the kinds of privilege that people like you and I have. And I think for me, the book was a fine opportunity to do that, and to think about the life of someone like Harper Lee and the role she played in helping us to think about diversity and difference and discrimination. And I think for that reason, it might not surprise people to learn she was the origin of all of this. And I had gone down for the New Yorker to Alabama to write a story about her. It was when Go Set a Watchman was announced, and the world learned that there was a second book from Harper Lee, which, we can talk about later. It turned out to actually be the first one she'd ever written. It was a very early draft of Mockingbird, but I went down to write about her, and I found out about this true crime project she had undertaken in the 70s and 80s. And because she had done so much reporting and research, a lot of other writers had not looked into the case and had decided not to write about it because they were afraid of being scooped by Harper Lee. And so here was this great story waiting to be told, and a story that she herself was a part of, and that would bring it forward from the 70s and 80s all the way to today. So I was just lucky. I went down at the right time, and it was near the end of her life. So people who had never talked about her before, friends and family, were more willing to do that. And everything kind of came together. And when I say everything, I mean the book too, that there were some very different lives to put in conversation with one another. And the alleged serial killer in this book is a Black man, and the vigilante who murdered him is Black too. And you mentioned the white lawyer who defended them both, and that lawyer had also had a pretty interesting career in Democratic politics before he settled into small town law. So it was really, the perfect story for me, and I got to write about religion and politics and literary history. There's just a lot at work in it, but I found my way to the story because of Harper Lee.
Let me ask you, you write a lot about race and politics in the Deep South, but you grew up and you live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in Talbot County, which has its own fraught racial history of segregation and racism. You probably know Eastern Shore legislators opposed inclusion in the state's 1964 civil rights law, and in the 1963 version, all Eastern Shore counties were exempted from the law. There is a statue at the courthouse, the Boys of Talbot, a Confederate statue, more recently another statue of Frederick Douglass. How has growing up in Talbot County on the Eastern Shore of Maryland affected your worldview, and how has it informed your work in general and prepared you for the world you entered to report and write Furious Hours?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question, and I should just say right away, since we're digital and folks aren't only there in Gaithersburg, for folks who are listening, there's going to be a rally tomorrow at the Talbot County Courthouse, which is the circuit court here in Talbot County. And as Jean mentioned, we're going to gather in George Floyd's memory, and we're going to call for racial justice right under the Talbot Boys statue. It's still there. There is still a CSA monument right outside the courthouse. And years ago, there was a controversy over honoring Frederick Douglass, and on that same courthouse green. And there's now a beautiful statue to Frederick Douglass. And at the time, I shared the opinion of a lot of people that the two statues together told the story, and we should keep both. And I've lived long enough to regret that, and I really hope that one of the outcomes of the protest tomorrow is that finally that CSA monument is taken down, because a lot of people who go to that courthouse, whether it's to pay a parking ticket or get their marriage license, a lot of people of color have to look at that statue every time they enter and wonder if it's still part of the justice system or not. So I think a lot about where I grew up, and look, it's a beautiful part of the country, and I grew up fishing and crabbing, and it's a wonderful place to live. And I grew up on a farm, and there's a reason when I went to Alabama and when I, spent a little bit of time in Harper Lee's hometown, it felt so similar to me. It felt a lot like where I'd grown up, in good ways and in bad ways. And I think that, I'm of a generation, I hope, where a lot of us feel like we don't have to live the way our grandparents did, and we do not have to maintain the statues our parents fought to maintain. And the ways of the future should be here now. So I'm glad you asked about it. And I do think in general, the chance to talk about Harper Lee when I've gone on the book tour, you talk about her when you're in Boston, or you talk about her when you're in New York. And the truth is, racism is a national problem in this country. It doesn't only exist in Alabama, and you're not better just for having been born outside of the Deep South. So I think for me, I felt awfully comfortable down there, and I grew up in a religious household, so I was comfortable going to church with sources. And I think a lot about the virtues of small towns, but also the vices. And there was some hard work for me too in this book, thinking about the way that Harper Lee, as a white person, wanted to tell a story about the experience of Black Americans. And look, part of my book talks about the experience of Black Americans in the 20s and 30s all the way up through the 70s. And I think for me, I tried to approach it with humility and honesty and circumspection about what I could understand and what I couldn't, and what had been well done in the past and not well done, and more importantly, whose voices had already been heard and whose voices hadn't. So I'm grateful for where I grew up, and I'm grateful for all the ways it's changing. And there are plenty of signs around the community already in anticipation of tomorrow that say Black Lives Matter and equality for all. And I think, that's always been part of this story. Frederick Douglass got a statue because he was born and raised here too. And we might as well look back at our moral genealogy and find the people we can be proud of and make statues for them and tell their stories more than the stories we've lifted up in the past. So thanks for asking about it. And it's true, I live not far from where I grew up, so I'm talking to you from Caroline County, and the Eastern Shore is beautiful and wonderful, but it's as complicated a place as the Deep South.
Yes, indeed. I was intrigued by the title of your book, Furious Hours, which I found a bit mysterious at first. Later on in the book, I learned where it came from, but could you please explain how you chose it and its significance to the work of Harper Lee and to the work of writers in general?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question, Gene. And, plenty of people who read the book carefully and thoughtfully still come out the other side wondering why the heck that's the title. And I just want to say, first of all, when you publish a book, so many people help bring it into the world. And in my case, there were a lot of folks at Knopf, that's my publisher, who helped with the copy editing and the cover and the design and the layout. And there are some folks there too who help you with your titles. And the reason my book has such an explanatory subtitle is I think they worried no one would know what the heck it was about. So they added all the nouns you needed to know about in order to know whether or not the book was for you. So Murder, Fraud, and The Last Trial of Harper Lee do a lot of work, and I'm grateful that someone said, well, we ought to tell people what this book is about. But if you've read the book, you know that Furious Hours is this phrase that comes from one of the only public lectures Harper Lee ever gave. And she was giving a talk about Alabama history. And here we are talking about Black lives. Harper Lee in that talk really lifted up the experience of some of the indigenous tribes who had inhabited Alabama before white settlers arrived. And in fact, the phrase Furious Hours refers to the last battle of the Creek War, which is what caused the exodus of Creek Indians from Alabama. And it was when, soon to be President Jackson led a brigade of Army soldiers against the Creeks, and it was a terrible slaughter, and the Tallapoosa River bled. And she's talking about that history and what Alabamians know about their past and what they don't know. And I loved that phrase. And that last battle, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, took place very near where all of these murders took place. And in fact, Harper Lee, for a lot of the time she was in town working on this book, was staying at the Horseshoe Bend Motel. So I liked that I could lift up that Creek history, which I didn't get to talk about much in the book, and marry it to the ongoing stories of violence and the ongoing fight for ownership in this area, because of course it is a long history. It doesn't just go back to slavery. When you think about race relations in the South, it does go back to the interactions between the colonists and the indigenous peoples. So it's a little bit of an echo, and I love that it's her words, because a lot of this book is about her and her gifts as a writer. And it's a beautiful, evocative phrase. And, I think I chose it for the title because it comes from her, but it speaks to all three characters. There are no more furious hours in this book than the hours when a man was accused of murdering his wife. And I think about the political career of this, would-be liberal in the Deep South. And boy, did he spend a lot of time arguing with his colleagues in the Alabama State Senate and arguing with people in his party about integration. And
the lawyer,
the lawyer, yeah, the middle part of the book, that lawyer who was a politician in his early days. And then, of course, there's Harper Lee, where I'm sure we're going to talk more about her, but the story of Harper Lee's life post Mockingbird was a lot of furious hours at the typewriter. Just because she wasn't publishing didn't mean she wasn't trying to write. And I think that, for writers who busy themselves with complicated stories, fury is the right word for what you sit down and try to do when you try to make sense of the world. So it spoke, I thought, to all three of them. But I'm not fussy. So when someone says, oh, I think you ought to call it something else, I'm open to suggestions. And I'm, again, very glad for the subtitle, which clarifies it all anyway.
So do you, as a writer, have any furious hours?
No, I mean, I will say in that sense, it's not my experience as a writer. And these characters were all hard to write about for different reasons. But when it comes to Harper Lee, I thought she'd be the one I had the most in common with. But she's a very different writer than I am. And she really suffered over her work, and she struggled with it. And to some extent, she valorized that suffering and thought, in order for writing to be good, you had to slave over it and think about it and work hard on it and just be miserable over it. And that's not my experience. I love my work. I do it mostly with joy and gratitude for getting paid to do it. A lot of people have harder jobs and they work harder, or they don't get to pursue their passion. So no, I have furious hours with, the garden and the weeds in it and, all kinds of things, the way police treat Black people. But no, when I sit down to write, it's mostly easy and fun, and I just feel lucky to get to do it for a living.
Which do you prefer, the reporting or the writing, if you had to choose?
Oh man, I love them. I love getting to do both, because the truth is, right around the time I get bored with reporting, it's time to start writing. And a lot of what I work on requires research or talking to people who've studied it. And so, if you get frustrated with the writing, or you don't know enough, then you have the opportunity to go and learn from other people. So I like them both about the same, and I'm glad that both are a part of my life. I do a lot of book reviews, and there it can feel a little more solitary and lonely. And I love, with reporting, you can just pick up the phone and call somebody and see what they think, or talk to them about their work. And so I like to do a little of both.
You say in your book, nothing writes itself. And then you say Janet Malcolm called the space between reporting and writing an abyss. Everyone told Harper Lee the story she had found was destined to be a bestseller, but no one could tell her how to write it. Can you talk a little bit about the abyss between the reporting and the writing? I guess that's not something you've so much experienced from what you said.
Yeah, that's a fine question. And it's certainly true that, look, I mean, the premise of this book is Harper Lee knew about this case right after it happened. And she went to town and she did all the same work I did. And she's a better writer than I am. And I think there's a straightforward question of, well, why then couldn't she write a book about it? And I do think Janet Malcolm's right. It is simply true that the things that happen in the world are chaotic and disparate, and they do not necessarily have a narrative, even though they happen day after day. Other than chronology, there's nothing that makes sense of it, or that tells you who's right or who's wrong, or which themes are important. And newspapers every day try and make sense of the world, and we all, if you keep a diary or you sit down to dinner and you want to talk about your day, you have to start making a plot out of it. And I think that's the abyss she means. On top of that, there's some question of if you're going to do it with artistry, if you're going to do more than just pull people's quotes in and tell you what the temperature was, if you're going to try and write beautiful sentences or shape a story that has echoes and reverberations, you can start to bring art and craft into it. But even just figuring out what happened and what order to tell it in, that's the abyss. And I think for poor Harper Lee, when she had done all this reporting and all this research, and she had her stacks of papers and she had her court transcripts and her death certificates, there was still a question of, well, who was the main character? And what were the themes? And who was the hero? And who was the villain? And who should we root for? And there was just problem after problem that she couldn't quite figure out how to solve. And I do have a lot of sympathy for it. And I've talked to some writers since the book came out too, who really struggle with writer's block. Either because they had a really successful book and then tried to figure out how to do it again, or they're just someone who's always wanted to write but couldn't figure out how to do it. And they tell you the story of their life, or they tell you the story they want to write about, and you just think, that's perfect, that's wonderful, I want to read that book. And of course the question is how to get it down on the page, and what quotes to use, and where to make the chapter breaks. And I'm sympathetic to it all. It's a lot to decide, and it is difficult, and it can be done well or poorly. So that's what I think poor Harper Lee was wrestling with. And the truth of the matter is, if you've read Go Set a Watchman, you've already got a kind of fine illustration of the difference between the two, because Go Set a Watchman is the version of, Scout's story she wrote first. And then you go and you read To Kill a Mockingbird and you realize, well, everything is a choice. You can choose the chronology, you can choose the narration, you can choose which scenes happen. And I'm of the mindset that she did a better job of it in Mockingbird than in Watchmen. And an editor sat down and helped her make better choices than the ones she'd done in her first draft. And if there are writers listening, you can go back to your first draft of something and realize, yeah, sometimes that abyss is real wide and hard to bridge. And I think Janet Malcolm's right that it can be truly sad, and it can be burdensome for some people. It's mostly not for me, but I'll tell you, again, the truth of the matter is Harper Lee's a better writer than I am. So I think sometimes the artistry people struggle with is I'm playing checkers and they're playing chess. They're doing something else. And I've talked to poets too, and I mention this in the book. I quote this sonnet that Robert Lowell wrote for Elizabeth Bishop, and those are two poets I love, and they have a complicated and interesting friendship. But Robert Lowell says that Elizabeth Bishop says she's the casual muse who makes every day perfect. But then he says she leaves holes in her poems for 10 years on end, that she spends 10 years trying to figure out the right word for something. And then the poetry she wrote is beautiful, but she didn't produce very much of it. And I think partly that's because of this high standard. And, to go back to Janet Malcolm's word, this abyss between what you see and what you would like to communicate, and how you actually do it with this imperfect material, which is language.
Well,
so that was a long rambling answer, which is to say I'm sympathetic to it and I can bring it to life and I can think about poor Harper Lee, but I'm just not quite as cerebral. So when I sit down to do it, I just think, well, language is always imperfect and inadequate, but we've got to muddy through.
Well, it seemed also that she was overwhelmed by all of her material. I had an editor who used to refer to this very kindly. He'd say, well, what you have here is an embarrassment of riches. And that was a nice way of saying,
Yeah, well, and she had an embarrassment of riches of both kinds, because I know Jean, she had a different problem than it sounds like you and I do. That book did so well. Mockingbird was an instant bestseller and an ongoing bestseller, and that meant that Harper Lee did not have to write for a living. She could live off her royalties. And I think another thing that just reinforced this kind of dysfunction about her work is she never had deadlines and she never needed anything more than the royalty check from Mockingbird. And that's part of her story too. And I think that's probably part of it that people who know anything about her life have intimated. She was partly stymied by success, that the material success of Mockingbird meant she was exempt from the normal pressures of writing, which is you have to produce in order to earn money with your craft.
Yeah. You also say that that the facts for her were in short supply when she tried to come to grips with the material. Yet you were successful in unearthing many of the facts that seem to have eluded her. How did you accomplish that?
Yeah, that's a charitable thing to say, and I think it's not quite true, because at the end of the day, I had an advantage Harper Lee didn't, which is that I was willing to make her a character, and she never would have. It's very common in true crime today. It's actually, I think, one of the dominant modes of storytelling in narrative nonfiction about crime. The writer or the podcaster tells you all about their experience of trying to learn who did it and how, or why some piece of justice was miscarried, and they're a character in the story. And Harper Lee would never have done that. She was pathologically private. She believed in old-fashioned journalism. So she only wanted to make characters out of the people who had experienced these murders, who had been part of the trials, the lawyers, the law enforcement officers. And she would never have told you what it was like to interview these people or what she thought of them. It was all embedded in the story. And I was lucky because a lot of my book is about her life and what made her a writer and what made her interested in this case and what was hard for her. So, I was never Casey Cep complaining about, oh, how so-and-so wouldn't talk. I just told you that person was a difficult person for Harper Lee. And when I said, it's hard to reconstruct the life of a black sharecropper, because Willie Maxwell was a black sharecropper who became a preacher and was in later life accused of all this. I can tell you about how hard it was for Harper Lee to understand that, and it doesn't sound self-pitying that me as a writer found that difficult, or that I as a researcher found it difficult to find the same amount of newspaper coverage about the Reverend that I could find about Tom Radney or Harper Lee. So I got to include her, and poor thing, she was never going to do that. And she was never going to bring herself into the story. So that made it a little easier for me.
But you were able to write more about Willie Maxwell and his career as a minister than apparently she was able to. How did you?
Yeah, so I was lucky. I mean, his military records turned up. This becomes a kind of show your work moment, and I'm happy to do it, because the truth is it's not a story of triumph for me. It's a story of triumph of a lot of librarians and archivists. And I was really lucky. The military helped me find some of his Army records. There were kind of extended members of his family who shared things. There were digital newspaper archives of the kind that Harper Lee just didn't have. So I could cast a really wide net for any mention of the Reverend Maxwell. And I was able to bootstrap some of that. You know, somebody who knew something told me somebody else who did, or someone who had this letter told me someone else who might have other letters. And in general, you know, I built a little bit of a superstructure for the Reverend out of WPA archives, you know, out of general histories of Tallapoosa and Coosa County. So even if I couldn't tell you what his experience on a particular plantation was like, I could look at sharecropper stories from the era and from that place and that time and start to bring it to life. And I think even there, I probably was a little bolder than she was. You know, it's never speculation. It's always built from archives and history. But every so often you see me start to pull back from the life of the Reverend, like for instance, his military service. I could talk to historians of the army bases where he served and tell you about the segregated barracks or about the way it felt to live there. Even if Willie Maxwell could never tell me personally, I could start to draw on materials to situate his world. And I think even there, Harper Lee was incredibly conservative, and she wouldn't have told you anything more than what she had learned from direct interviews and direct evidence in this era. And, you know, that's why my book has so many, you know, bibliographic entries. I want you to know where I'm drawing materials from. And so when I quote Langston Hughes and I tell you what he thought about segregation in the Army at the time that the Reverend was serving, you know that I'm getting that from Langston Hughes, and it's an opinion piece he wrote. But, you know, I felt like you have to bridge out a little bit. And if you can't, you have to tell readers what they may never know.
I thought you were able to provide a lot of context, the social context, the world in which he lived, and also, I mean, the whole geology of the area where you talked about the towns that were flooded by the reservoir that became this lake around which the story revolves. And I thought that was really helpful for a reader to see beyond just the, you know, the two-dimensional stick figures that you write about.
Yeah, well, and I'll tell you, I mean, that's a kind of narration I borrowed directly from Harper Lee. I love the beginning of Mockingbird where, you know, Scout and Jem are talking about what Atticus has told them. And they basically say you can't understand somebody unless you go all the way back to their family's role in the Battle of Hastings, which is to say that whatever is happening today has a lot to do with what happened yesterday and all the yesterdays before that. And I think for me, it was so obvious when I looked at, so this story, Harper Lee was born in Monroeville, but the story takes place in a town called Alexander City, and it's over near the Georgia line. And when I got to Alex City and I looked around, you know, it's a mill town, and a lot of the people who live and work there, if they don't work for the mill, then their parents did or their grandparents did. And it was a mill town mechanized by hydroelectric power. And so it's very obvious to me when you start thinking about who has power and what violence has happened, part of that story is about the way that the watershed changed and these mills became mechanized by hydroelectric power. You cannot talk about the money and the affluence of some parts of the community or the ongoing exploitation of Black workers who work the line in these mills unless you go back and explain how the profit structure worked then and what changed life there and why there are even towns of the size there are. So I love history, and I really do think it's the way we make sense of the world. And I think to some extent Harper Lee agreed with that. That part of what she's doing in Mockingbird is telling you about how people in Macomb relate to each other because of how their parents related to each other, and who is allowed to change or evolve and who isn't, and who's in control of the way society works. So that part I owe entirely to her. And the little bit we know about her work on her book, she was going to call her book The Reverend. And the little bit we know about the Reverend is quite a lot of it is about the history of the area. You know, she was going to sit you down and tell you about the Tallapoosa River and sit you down and tell you about the early migration to Alabama from the Carolinas and these poor Irish people who moved there. So she was just as interested in history as I am. And I like to think even if she hated that she was in the book, I like to think she'd had a soft spot for Furious Hours because it cares about history as much as she did.
Did you empathize with her at any point in your research or writing?
Oh my gosh, over and over again. I mean, empathize and was jealous of and all kinds of feelings. I think that there's a couple of really good books I like about biography. And one of them was written by a guy named James Atlas, and another is written by a guy named Jeff Dyer. And Jeff Dyer was supposed to be writing a biography of D.H. Lawrence, and he ended up writing a whole book about how much he hated it and hated D.H. Lawrence and hated biography and how hard it was and how hard it was to write. And I love that book. It's called Out of Sheer Rage. And I think that, you know, even if you're writing a biography of your grandparents, at various points you're judgmental of decisions they made or decisions they could have made, or how hard they're making your life by not writing their memoirs or something. And Harper Lee's in there. Every so often I thought, she's so ornery. Why couldn't she have just, you know, written more of her life down? Or you'd read a letter where she's absolutely furious that there's a article about her and she says it's riddled with errors, but she doesn't bother to itemize what they are. Or, you know, she says she's furious at so-and-so, but she won't get into why. And so, you know, as a biographer, you're always trying to make sense of someone's life. And there are moments where you wish they were a different way. And I mean, look, over and over again, I love Harper Lee's work, and I wish there were 100 more novels like Mockingbird. And I think much more often than I, you know, judged her or felt any kind of anger towards her, I just felt sympathy. And, you know, we were talking about her attitudes towards writing. The truth is those attitudes were reinforced by, you know, pretty serious depression and a pretty serious, at different points in her life, drinking problem. And I have a world of sympathy for that. And I think that her life was very hard, and not just because she made it that way. And I wish, like a lot of people who are close to her, that she had been able to get help. And, you know, this was a time when AA was really becoming a force for good in the world, and talk therapy was becoming popular. And I wish that she had gotten help, because I think it would have helped. And I think that there was nothing going on in her life that other people haven't found a way through. And so mostly when I was working on the book, I just felt a lot of sympathy for her life, post Mockingbird especially, when she was young and full of ambition. And even when she was working on The Reverend, she was full of enthusiasm and energy, and she's a gregarious person. And she was, you know, people just delighted in her company because she was a wit and a wonder and had an encyclopedic mind. And I just wish she could have lived that life all the time, and that she hadn't collapsed into some of these bad habits. So most of the time, I just wish things could have been easier for her. But that's true of the Reverend too. I mean, I'll tell you, that guy is the alleged serial killer in the book, and a lot of people feel like he took loved ones from him, and that he wrecked the community, and he wreaked havoc, and he committed insurance fraud. But I'll tell you, the Reverend, who was, you know, who received a medal for valorous service in World War II, I wish when he had come home to Alabama that there had been a good job for him, and that there had been opportunity, and that someone as gifted as he was at preaching, you know, could have had a full-time parish and done it for a living, and that just his life could have gone differently. So I have a lot of sympathy, and there's more than enough of it to go around in this story. And, you know, Harper Lee is at the top of that list. I've spent the most time thinking about her, but I think it's true of everybody else in the book too. I wish Tom Radney, you know, could have run for office in 1997 instead of 1967. You know, here's a guy who was for integration and wanted Alabamians to pay their taxes with joy. And, you know, he ran on that platform, and, you know, he got run out of town for it. And his family was terrorized and threatened. And so I have a lot of sympathy for everybody in the book, including her.
But he still loved Robert E. Lee, as I recall reading in your book.
He's a complicated guy. Yeah. I mean, look, Tom and Harper Lee both. I think that, you know, a couple of people have told me they were so surprised to read about Harper Lee's politics. And, you know, at one point in the book, I say she's basically an uncivil curmudgeon was her political persuasion. But look, she did not approve of the methods of the Freedom Riders, for instance. And I think that's shocking to people who, because of the just clear moral voice of the book, assume that she was out marching with King, or that she participated in the bus boycotts or something. And that was not her life. And in fact, the kind of complicated racial politics of Watchmen, which is to say, you know, someone who was anti-lynching but maybe not pro-integration, is much closer to her perspective on the world. She was, I think, much more conservative and you know, manners minded than morally minded than I think a lot of people know. And I think that's very hard to make sense of. So yeah, so here, you know, one thing she had in common with Tom is they were progressive Southerners, but progressive by comparison, and only if you compared them to Wallace, not if you compared them to King. So I think that that's probably much more shocking to people than her drinking or her depression, is the confusion and the ongoing tension she felt about racial justice in this country. And I think, to her credit, she let her book do a lot of the talking for her, and her book changed a lot of people's minds in ways that maybe she wouldn't have been able to. So I think, that's a complicated part of the book. And so again, when you ask me, how do you feel about Harper Lee? I think I expected to find, she was secretly funding the marches, or that she was, privately corresponding with King. And that is not who she was. In fact, she was worried that the Freedom Riders were causing more trouble than they were doing good. And in fact, when she lived in New York, I think part of the reason she came home to Alabama was really a retreat from the kind of forward march of history up there. So I think she's a very complicated person, and the Atticus of Watchmen, who some people just wish had been written by someone else and that it were all a fraud, is really a much more accurate reflection of her own struggle to make sense of the world and figure out race relations and figure out the way that civil society should work.
Well, you write that from a marketing standpoint, the difficulty was that the Willie Maxwell case was not exactly an ideal parable about race and justice. She knew all too well that the story of a black serial killer wasn't what readers would expect from the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. If she were trying to get it published today, do you think from the publishers in New York, she would get a different reception or the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question for her specifically. Look, I obviously, my book was published. It tells the story she was interested in telling. But, it tells it in a way that confronts major failures of policing in the South, major miscarriages of justice, systematic discrimination within our criminal justice system, and real scrutiny on the part of white allies and people who were involved in the civil rights movement or who were involved in democratic politics. And I think there's a real question, anyone would have published anything she wanted to publish. But she was certainly told over and over again that this was a controversial book from her. And that, and I think in some ways I thought about this too. The strange thing about Furious Hours, about the Maxwell case, is it tells the story of two black men who everyone knew were guilty of murder, but were not convicted. And that is a very, statistically not representative story about justice, criminal justice in the South. Look, I love to remind people that there is another beautiful book about racial justice that came out of Monroeville, and it's Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. And it tells a much more statistically representative story about the fate of black men in our criminal justice system. They are, much more likely to be convicted of murders they did not commit than they are to be acquitted of murders they did. And so I think that's the sense in which, the Maxwell case is messy and complicated, and people would not have wanted it to be the next story from the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. And she was told over and over again, couldn't she find another story about moral heroism, not one about, moral complexity? And I think, there's another aspect of that embedded in the Maxwell case, which is that on the one hand, the motive for these serial killings was insurance fraud. The Reverend took out policies on people he was then accused of killing, and he profited a great deal from the policies. But I try to remember every time I give a book talk to point out the obvious, which is there again, that is not statistically representative of what was happening to Black Americans with the insurance industry. Much more common was they were either denied policies outright, or they were price gouged in the policies they could buy, or the policies themselves were much less generous than the policies available to their white neighbors. And worse than that, when they went to collect on them, they were often denied payments they were entitled to. And, here is the Reverend, once again, kind of one of the only Black men who wins at this game, who profits from this industry, which is systematically exploiting his neighbors and his peers and his colleagues. So even there, it is a difficult story to tell, because not many Black men were profiting off life insurance at this moment. He happens to be one of the only ones who was. And that's part of the reason I think these insurance companies were so furious and frustrated by the process. He was a grieving widow who would go before these civil juries and win judgment after judgment, which was just not expected and not common for the time. And, again, here's poor Harper Lee. She's supposed to be telling this one kind of story, and it's muddied by the whole systematic story that's behind it. So it's an interesting case for her to have chosen.
Well,
And I think there are very straightforward reasons it was hard to tell, and why it was not straightforward.
put aside for a moment that she was the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Do you think that story would be marketable today? Or is it too messy, too complicated, and doesn't?
I mean, I wrote a book about it. I think we're living in a,
you wrote a book about writing the book. I'm just talking about the narrative of Willie Maxwell and his.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think to the great credit of publishers and finally publishers and movie producers and TV show executives, it is its own kind of discrimination to decide that you will only tell laudatory and simple stories about Black lives. And I think that, it's interesting, right around the time I was finishing the book, I was talking to a Black writer who asked if I had gone to see Black Panther, the Marvel comic movie. And, that question was about the idea that, of course, there should be Black villains as well as Black heroes. And so, no, I think she would have been fine. The real question is, did she want to, and would she have wanted to? And I think we can, in the best version of life, everyone gets to be as complicated as everyone else. And that includes a story like this. And, I loved getting to interview Robert Burns, who's the vigilante at the heart of this story. And Robert's alive and well. He came to the book event I did in Alex City. And, Robert, as much as anyone, is aware that what he did is both villainous and heroic. And that what he did, upset a lot of people and pleased a lot of others, and that it was complicated. And he's willing to talk about it, and he's willing to puzzle through it all. But he also knows, he can't pretend it never happened. And I think when we start to decide what kinds of stories can or can't be told, we have to be very careful, because it is its own kind of discrimination, and it flattens the complexity of other people's lives. And the truth is, the Maxwell case doesn't just have a Black serial killer, it has Black victims. And the Reverend was accused of killing two wives, a brother, a nephew, and a stepdaughter. And if you decided you couldn't tell his story, you would never tell theirs. And you would never talk about the way the police investigated those cases versus any other, or the way that the justice system, brought charges of murder in some cases, but not others. And when you start to say something like, well, just because there are statistically fewer Black serial killers, we think, than there are white serial killers, you just decide whole swaths of life won't be talked about. So I think she would have been fine with this book, and I think it would have been interesting, and I think it could have been well done. And I still wish every day to get to read her version of the same case.
Well, I was going to ask you, her papers are sealed by her estate. I think you got to look at a few papers, and Tom Radney had a briefcase, and there was just a little snippet. And if you could speculate what were in those sealed papers.
That's its own kind of roller coaster. I mean, there were a lot of days I woke up nervous that someone was going to call and say, well, we found the Reverend and we're going to publish it, because, to answer a different version of your question, I think if Harper Lee had published her version of this case, no one would have read my version. I wouldn't have read my version. I would have wanted hers. And so I woke up really nervous, because I think highly of her as a writer. It was clear to me from my interviews she had amassed all the materials she would have needed to write it. I had these letters where she would say things like, I'm 3/4 of the way through. And so it seemed very plausible to me that there was a manuscript that was extant. And there are people very close to her. I have this paragraph in the book where I kind of round up as best I can the expert opinions of friends and family of Harper Lee and people she talked to when she was working on this version of the events. And, on the far boundary, there's someone who says she wrote the whole thing. Her sister Louise read it and told me it was better than In Cold Blood. And then on the other side, you have, people who are close to her who just said she was incredibly dysfunctional at this time. It was a very dark time. It was a very hard story to tell. And after doing all that reporting and research, she could never finish it. So those are the two extremes of she wrote it all and she never wrote it. And, I think it's ask me today versus tomorrow. Some days I still think we might find a manuscript, and some days I think we won't. But I think with some amount of certainty, that archive probably contains more draft pages, and that's what you referred to. Both that she made notes. She was an incredibly scrupulous reporter, and We know from her collaboration with Truman Capote on In Cold Blood that every day when she finished reporting, she would go home and type up her notes of who she had interviewed or who she had talked to and what they said and her impressions. And I think almost certainly she would have kept those. And that's the page of notes that Tom Radney had in a briefcase that was returned to his estate by her estate, or a page of notes where she was interviewing the Reverend's sister. And I think there's every reason to believe whatever she wrote of the book, whatever she kept, maybe she burned what she wrote, maybe she recycled it, whatever she did with the manuscript, I think we have every reason to believe there will be notes, and we'll be able to see all the interviews she did and all the people she talked to, because I tried as best I could to do all that. But the truth is, some of the people she was able to interview had died by the time I came along, including Tom Radney. I could interview his widow and his children and his grandchildren and his colleagues, but Harper Lee got to spend hours and hours and hours talking to him. And the Reverend's widow was alive. The Reverend was accused of killing 2 wives, but if you can believe it, there was a third woman who married him, and that woman was alive and well when Harper Lee was investigating this case. And so I would love to see those reporting notes. Whatever there is of the manuscript pages, I would love to see those reporting notes.
Did you make much use of obituaries in your reporting?
Oh yeah, thanks, Gene. You threw me the softball. I did. I will say that this is a critical moment for local journalism, and papers are folding left and right. And I hope that the book lovers who are listening to this maybe think about subscribing to a local paper, because I couldn't have written my book without a few of them in Alabama. And some of that is just the reporting they did to cover the events as they happened, and some of that is just the way they recorded lives. Now, they didn't do it fairly or justly, but even the imperfect record, those obituaries were how, if someone had died, I could go and see their nieces and nephews and go track them down and interview them. Or, you could piece together the life of someone, the jury foreman. You could know what he did for a living because you could find his obituary, and that gave context to the stories. So I'm awfully grateful to those local papers. And I was talking about archivists earlier, but my God, the state archives in Montgomery are phenomenal, and the local archives at the Horseshoe Bend Regional Library near where this all happened are phenomenal. And they would just let me, read along in the basement decades and decades of local newspaper coverage, or scroll through microfilm of, what the Birmingham News or the Alabama, Journal had covered with this stuff. And I love it. And you can't write a book like this without it. And if we lose it, the people who try and write books like this 70 years from now about today won't be able to do it. They won't have the context they need. They won't have the historical record they need. And so I think it's really a moment, buy your books from your local bookstore, Politics and Prose, or whatever your, Curious Iguana, or wherever you are, and buy your books there, and subscribe to a local paper, because the New York Times can't cover everything. And what the New York Times covers sometimes depends on the ecosystem of these smaller papers. So I know it's a tough time and a tight time for a lot of people, but when you do think about spending your money, I think you've got to spend some of it local, and you've got to just really support these institutions, because without them, our world will be totally different.
So if I can borrow a question from the New York Times Book Review section, what books are on your night table?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I love to look at that when they do it. And I'm working on 2 pieces for the New Yorker. My day job is writing for the New Yorker, and I'm working on 2 pieces for them. One is about Marilynne Robinson, who has a new novel coming out this fall. So I'm absolutely embarrassed by the riches of my nightstand, which is everything she's ever written, all the essay collections, all the novels. And then the other piece I'm working on is a nonfiction book about the legacy of William Faulkner. And so the other towering looming stack is everything Faulkner wrote. So I'm a pig at the trough. I've just got lots of good stuff I'm reading, nothing contemporary or new. But I'll say, for people who are looking, I'm doing that because of my job, but for people who are looking for books that can guide them through this moment, there's a lot of just phenomenal nonfiction out there. And I've been looking at a book by William Stuckley, who's an academic at UNC, and he wrote a book called Hattiesburg, and it's a beautiful, beautiful, complete book about Hattiesburg and the lives of Black and white citizens there. And so that's a book I really admire. And if you're looking for something that can take you through the long history of how we have just badly treated Black people in this country, that's a book I would recommend. And if not that, then you know, there's a new collection Knopf just put out of Toni Morrison's essays, The Source of Self-Regard. That's a really beautiful collection. And there's just so much good contemporary writing about the moment we're in that I hope people will take a look at. I would recommend Faulkner and Robinson too, but you know, I'm sure those are probably people have already read.
So one final question. Is there a book in your future, another book?
Oh gosh, I hope so. I mean, I've got an idea about a shipwreck that I've been kind of loosely working on. I got busy with work, but I'm hoping the next book is about a slightly more historical story. It's a shipwreck from the 17th century, but it has a contemporary hook because somebody went and found it, and then there was a big legal fight over who owned the treasure. So I'm hoping to put that book together, and it'll be a little bit like Furious Hours because it's partly about the Spanish Empire that built the ship and sent it over to the New World, and it's partly about, you know, the people who worked in the mines recovering the silver and the jewels that were being sent back to Spain, and then it's partly about this contemporary legal fight. So it's a little bit of a true crime story because there's a huge fight over who owns it, and as far as I'm concerned, the story of colonialism in Peru and Colombia might as well just be a story about theft. So that's what I'm hoping to put together, but it'll be a little while.
Well, that's great. We'll look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So in the best version of life, everyone gets to be as complicated as everyone else. That is a quote I love. That was excellent. You guys, this was amazing. We've got several questions here, but before we get to the questions, I wanted to let everyone know that Casey's dedication to being here today brought her out to a local school where she could get adequate Wi-Fi. Are you doing okay with your power right now?
I was about to say, I'm going to switch to a different laptop for the questions. If you're going to round them up, give me 1 second. I'm going to log in there. I'm just switching them out for power.
No problem. You go ahead and do that.
Okay.
I'm going to ask Gene one in the meantime. So Gene, when we were talking in the beginning about this fantastic book, you had mentioned to me that it was more of a book in 3 parts. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on why you think that.
Well, it's again, we didn't really talk too much about structure and how you decide how to structure a book, but it was a natural flow to first write about the Reverend and all his alleged fraudulent claims and the women who died on whose deaths he collected. And then the second section was about this remarkable lawyer, Tom Radney, a white lawyer, who represented the Reverend. And then after the Reverend was fatally shot by one of the survivors, represented the murderer, and he was acquitted. And then the third section is about Harper Lee and her struggles to tell the story and her own personal demons. And I thought it was a very well put together, well thought out way to tell the story.
Especially for a first book, I would think. It's pretty impressive.
Very impressive. Very impressive.
Excellent. What are you working on these days? I know you've got a lot under your belt. You got something new on the fire?
Well, I've been working on a number of magazine articles, and I had a piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the Hudson Valley film industry being shuttered during the pandemic, and that was fascinating. I mean, who knew there was a Hudson Valley film industry unless you're up there? But it was quite thriving, and all of a sudden, it ended. But they're hoping that things will get back to where they were. At least nobody really knows to what extent. And then I've been working on a memoir intermittently about 50 years in the newspaper business, but it's really not so much about things that I covered through my lens, from the anti-war movement up to the 2000s. So, and Casey, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was seamless, Phil. Thanks so much. And I should just give a shout out to public schools and public libraries, because I'm probably not the only author in America who's getting by on public Wi-Fi. And I am over on the Eastern Shore, so we don't have much of the way of broadband, but I'm telling you to buy your books local and subscribe to a local paper. You know, pay your local taxes with joy, because a lot of people make use of these resources. And I'm grateful to be able to do it here. And thanks for your patience. And I hope the folks at home didn't mind the intermission. They probably enjoyed hearing from Gene more than me anyway.
Unlikely, but thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, we do have several questions here. So I'm going to dive right into those. The first one comes from Mary Chapman. Mary says, I am enjoying your book tremendously. Which of the 3 sections was the most interesting for you personally, and which was the most difficult to produce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And for a minute, my heart stopped, because Mary, you're going to learn there are some Chapmans in my book. And the Chapmans, so there's a curious thing about Harper Lee and how she got interested in this case. She actually had a niece who lived in Alexander City, where this all took place. And that niece had married a guy who owned a motel. So the Chapmans actually owned the Horseshoe Bend Motel. So I thought for a minute you were going to be a long lost Chapman and want to ask me something nitty gritty about Alex City, but that's such a generous question. And I feel like all 3 parts of this book were difficult for different reasons, but they were also just tremendously interesting for different reasons too. And I think that in some ways Harper Lee was the easiest person to research. You know, she's a world famous novelist, and so people had interviewed her and there had been some effort to preserve her papers. On the other hand, she's pathologically private, so it's not as straightforward as sometimes when you go to talk to people about a writer, they can't stop talking. And I'm reading that Marilyn Robinson material because I'm working on a profile of her, and she's absolutely accommodating and generous and kind. And, you know, people in her life have been willing to share stories. But in the case of Harper Lee, she policed what people said about her so much that there was this kind of omerta, and people who knew her wouldn't talk about her. And the people who knew her best said the least. So that was its own frustration over the years. And in some cases, it took me 3 years to convince some family member to talk, but eventually to convince them to share their stories. So she came around in that way, and whatever resistance there was mostly faded. But I'll tell you, in the case of the Reverend Maxwell, obviously, this is a story that for his family is very different than it is for anyone else in Alexander City and anyone else in the state of Alabama. And in fact, for a lot of people, this was macabre entertainment. And this was a titillating story they followed in the news, and they never felt like it was real. And of course, for his family, you know, 5 family members were murdered, and in some instances there was never a complete investigation, and there was never any closure about what had happened. And understandably, members of his family were less eager to talk about it. And understandably, for some of them, just for archival reasons, they had less access to the story of his life than, say, the Radney family did about Tom. Because when Tom did something, the local newspaper covered it. And, you know, when Tom won some award in school, his mother saved it, and they lived in the same house. So there was a continuous archive of his life. And so for structural reasons, it was a little harder to learn about the Reverend than it was either of the other 2 characters. So I think, you know, there were highs and lows with each of them, and some things that came more easily than others. So it's a great question. So that's the kind of approach question. But when you say, did I enjoy one more than the other? I probably actually enjoyed getting to write about the Reverend more, because there's so much in the way of ambiguity and mystery that are just inescapable, and you have no temptation to try and smooth them over or make them less complicated. So it is simply the case that we will never know why he did the things he did. You know, people interviewed him in his lifetime and they asked him, but he was either dishonest or inarticulate. And in the case of, you know, basic facts of his life, there are simply things we will never know about the decisions he made. And I think for me, that was challenging as a writer, to come up against it and figure out ways to be honest with readers about what they could ever know, but also to just sort of revel in the mystery of other people. Because again, people are endlessly complex, and the moment you think you understand them, if you're lucky, they remind you that you don't understand them at all. And so the Reverend was a kind of constant reminder of humility about what journalists can ever learn, or how much we can ever understand about something. So I think that's probably true. And, you know, he grew up fishing, and he grew up farming, and that felt very familiar to me in all the ways that our lives are totally different. And I would never understand. Coosa County is the most rural county in Alabama, and it's still today the most rural. And driving around and thinking about what it was like to grow up there, I got to set this kind of scene of a remote and rural and bucolic childhood. And again, for all that we don't have in common, I felt like I could understand that part of his life. And so for that reason, it was a lot of fun to get to write about.
Right. Denise writes, what would you like to find if you found Harper Lee's manuscript?
The whole thing. Do I have to choose? I just want to know it all. I mean, I really did. I can speak of it with such enthusiasm now, but I really was worried at various points that, God bless Knopf. I thought in the event that Harper Lee's book turns up, they're just going to say, well, this was a nice idea you had, but Harper Lee's already done it. So I was a lot more worried about it at the time, that what would she have gotten things right that I hadn't? Would she have had more materials than I had? Would she have just had more psychological insight? She was born and raised there. And as much as I said Alabama reminded me of the Eastern Shore, it is not the Eastern Shore. And parts of the state really, it gave us the civil rights movement, but there are places in Alabama that the movement bypassed. And Alexander City happens to be one of them. And race relations there were very different than in Montgomery or Birmingham. And I think that there's insight lifelong Alabamians would have that I could only grope at. And so I think I would want to read every word of it. And probably the best example of that is when I love the way the book opens with the Tallapoosa River, because it is a beautiful and mighty thing. And it's a fascinating geological story about how we change the natural world and we make sense of it and put it to use. But it's also just the case that Harper Lee had an eye for rivers and an eye for Alabama and an eye for red clay. And I would just love to read the way she described that river and the way she described the Creek Indians. And so I'd probably be awfully interested in the way she kind of set the scene and what her geography was. But there's a more tantalizing thing in the archive of Harper Lee. Here I'm talking so much about the Reverend, I'll just tease you all with something else. A couple of people who knew her really insisted to me that she kept a diary. And I mentioned this in the book, and I just think, the diary of Harper Lee would be a very strange and interesting thing, because she was very closed off from her own emotions and had a hard time talking about her work and these kind of deep she loved to talk, she loved to tell stories, she loved to repeat jokes, and she could weave an afghan from yarns that she knew, but she was private about herself. And so I think a diary would be every bit as interesting as the Reverend. The inner life of Harper Lee and the day-to-day experiences, I could piece some of that together from all the letters I got, but the diary would just be another level of access to her. So those are the two most tantalizing things I can tell you. And the archive is still sealed, and I've been told it's boxes and boxes and boxes, and I can't wait till we all see what's in it.
Nancy Redding has a two-part question for you. She says, why do you think Ghost Set a Watchman was never published during Harper Lee's lifetime? And part two to this is, do you think she would have supported the decision to have it published?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I gave a kind of cursory history of Ghost Set a Watchman, and I'm grateful to have a chance to kind of revisit it, because it was my entry point into the life of Harper Lee. And a lot of her friends and family did not approve of the decision to publish and were very concerned. The thing to know about Harper Lee's kind of publication history is that book came out right after the death of her older sister, who had been sort of her business manager and had really managed her affairs. That sister was a lawyer, and from Mockingbird forward had helped look after the publishing contracts and made decisions about different editions and adaptations and all sorts of things like that. The business of Harper Lee was run by her sister. And when her sister died in the fall of 2015 is when a lot of these kind of surprising decisions started to happen. So Watchmen was published, there was a Broadway adaptation that was authorized, and a lot of people were concerned because these were controversial but also lucrative decisions. And so I think it's worth scrutinizing, whether or not Harper Lee would have wanted Go Set a Watchman published. It was purported that she did, and she was alive at the moment that the contract was executed, along with the contract for the Broadway adaptation. So I think that, there are people who still ongoingly have questions and concerns, even if it was strictly legal, about her ability to consent and about her mental health at that time. And, there were allegations of elder abuse, and the state investigated them. And so I think it's a worthy thing to scrutinize who benefited from that decision and who made it. And to the point of this questioner, why it hadn't been made at an earlier point. Now, to play devil's advocate, some people say that's because the portrait of her father was so controversial. Maybe the death of her older sister is what changed, and she felt like the world could learn about this other version of Atticus, and that whatever would have been upsetting to her family was a little less upsetting to her. So that's one possibility. Whether or not she wanted it published, I still think that there could have been a better publication for the benefit of the world. And, this book was marketed as the sequel to To Kill a Mockingbird that, the 89-year-old Harper Lee had, worked on for decades and was proud to deliver to the world. And of course, that's a complete misrepresentation. It was a draft that she wrote in 1957 that she hadn't touched since then. It was lightly copy edited. And when it came into the world, I wish that it had come into the world as a slightly more academic project, one that would have had, the history of the letters between her and her editor and between her and her agent, and that would have pointed out that no publishing house would publish it, and that instead she revised To Kill a Mockingbird. And that would have embedded, there's a great book I'd love to recommend to folks who are interested in Watchmen. It's called Atticus Finch, a Biography. And it's written by a historian named Joseph Crispino. Sorry, it took me a minute. I was blanking on his name, Crispino. And I'm sure Politics and Prose will sell it to you. But Joseph Crispino goes back and looks at the history of race relations at the time. So the White Citizens Council and this more genteel version of the KKK. And he goes back and he pores over Harper Lee's father's editorials in the local paper and looks at, again, a much more realistic portrayal of the kind of everyday and systematic racism that Black people in Alabama faced. And, again, this category of person who would never have joined a lynch mob, but who didn't want their schools integrated or who wanted to go to a segregated church. And I love Joseph's book, and it's very well done. And I wish that when Go Set a Watchman had been published, instead of just being a novel that got pushed out, that everybody thought was the sequel, that it had actually been explained and annotated and made a little more understandable and intelligible to the audience who found it. Because I think it's like the question of why did the Reverend do what he did? We may never know with real certainty whether or not Harper Lee actually did want the book published, but having published it, I wish it had been done a little differently. Because there's so much more to learn when it's contextualized and not just pushed out into the world without any history or even an introduction. Again, I talked to some people who think that Harper Lee wrote that book in 2009 and that it took a few years to get published and then it came out. And when you say, well, she was in her late 20s and she was living in New York and she was angry at her father and she was confused about integration and she wrote that draft in 1957. And that's why it's so angry and that's why it's so muddled. And that's why the book is, frankly, a lesser aesthetic object than Mockingbird. So anyway, it's a great question. And I hope if you did read Go Set a Watchman, you get a little bit of this in my book, but Joseph Crispino's book is a fine exposition on all these themes. And, he wrote a biography of Strom Thurmond. So I think he's thought a lot about how complicated the story of race is in this country and how implicated many of us are who don't feel that we're racist in a racist society. So I hope if you were interested in Watchmen, you'll take a look at that because it makes the book far more interesting. And it makes us all a little more patient for what Harper Lee was up to, what all she was trying to make sense of, and how much the world was changing for people like her. So it's a great question. And I think, if you haven't read Watchmen, it's absolutely interesting as an example of how editors work magic, because you look at Watchmen and then you read Mockingbird and you just realize how much, she was gifted a good editor and what their collaboration produced, because it's a much more beautiful book, even if it is less politically complicated.
Judd says, Casey, one of the unusual things about this book is its structure. It's half true crime story, half biography. What was your inspiration for structuring the story this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have learned to love structure. If we think back to, Gene was asking me about that abyss that Janet Malcolm brings up, where you find this great story and you can't figure out how to tell it. And the truth is, I knew how this book was going to work from the get-go. When I first learned about the Maxwell case, it was obvious to me that Willie Maxwell was every bit as interesting as his lawyer, and that the two of them together were every bit as interesting as Harper Lee, and that the world didn't need another biography of Harper Lee. What they needed was a book that put her life in the context of other Alabamians. and in the context of other, aspects, other, classes, other races, other genders. And so it was clear to me it needed to be in 3 parts. And it might not be obvious to read it, but it also allowed me to work through the straight chronology of the story. So the book opens in basically 1925 when the Reverend is born. And we're with his perspective until he's gunned down in 1977. And then we're with his lawyer. And then once the trial concludes in 1977, we pick up with Harper Lee. So there are a lot of tangents and a lot of, meandering. And I should own up to the fact that I wrote the book the way I talk, which is really just in a wandering, in overly patient sort of way. And I love a good tangent and I love a good story. So I am always trying to walk down every, side street and go to the end of every cul-de-sac before I come back the way I was trying to go. So it does detour in some ways, but at the bottom of that structure is 1925 to 2016 when Harper Lee dies. So we go from when the Reverend was born to when she dies. So it felt like an obvious structure for that reason. And I did go and read a bunch of other books. If you're interested in structure, I don't know if this question comes from a writer, but John McPhee, who's a colleague of mine at the New Yorker, he put out a book a couple of years ago called Draft 4. And John is obsessed with structure. And that even has these illustrations of these kind of ornamental and geographic and geometric shapes of how he'll trace a story, or they crisscross, and all kinds of complexities. And I love him for it. And it's, if you are interested in structure, it is a book worth reading. But in my case, I had looked at 2 books, and one is Devil in the White City, which is Eric Larson's book about a serial killer in the Chicago World's Fair. And to some extent, Eric's book, which is beautiful, just has a structure like mine, but he alternates. So he goes back and forth between this serial killer and Frederick Olmsted, this landscape designer and city planner to some extent. So it's the same kind of structure, but he alternates. And same thing for the other book I like a lot, which is David Grann's Lost City of Z. And similarly, David chooses to kind of ping pong between perspectives. I set mine just in 3 parts because they're not quite similar enough. And I didn't want to pretend that Harper Lee had everything in common with a black sharecropper. She obviously doesn't. The Reverend has a very different experience of Alabama than she did. But David's book is about an Amazon explorer who went missing. And that's the kind of A plot. And then the B plot is David Grann, intrepid reporter who goes exploring the same portion of the Amazon rainforest looking for that story. And he kind of goes between the two. And you're in the past and you're in the future, and you're learning about exploration and you're learning about literary and archival exploration today. So those are 2 books I looked at a lot and I think are very well done, and they handle suspense well and they handle crime well, because of course you don't want to go looking at bad models of sensationalism or disrespectful crime books. And I think in both cases they're looking at suspense and violence in responsible and serious ways. So I love those 2, and I love John's book as well. And I could talk about books I admire truly all day, but those are 2 I did look a lot at when I was working on this.
Excellent. All right, Casey, we got the last question here. This is from Melissa McDonald. What do you think Harper Lee would say about your book?
Melissa, that is a fine question. And I try above all else to be honest. So I'll be honest. I don't think she would like it. Or rather, I think she would like the first 2/3, and then she would have scolded me for thinking that her story was worth incorporating, and probably been a little upset too about anyone who tried to pry into her private life, which of course is ultimately a lot of what I'm doing in her section. And I think that she would have admired, I said this earlier, but it's a serious and historical book, and it doesn't take for granted the ways that history acts on our lives today. And so I think she would have liked that. And she was pretty fussy about facts and about nonfiction and about the difference between the 2. There's a chapter of my book that looks at some of her discontents about In Cold Blood. And she had objections to some of the choices Capote had made and the way that he had structured his book and represented what you could know with certainty or without. So I really do think she would have admired my attempt to get to the bottom of it all, including her life, to not repeat rumor, to not rely on gossip, to be as scrupulous as I could. But I think at the end of the day, she'd have probably said, all right, I get it. The Reverend and the lawyer, you did a good job, kid. I get it. But, I just couldn't abide someone writing about me. So I think maybe she'd have like the first 2/3, but I gotta be honest, I don't think she would have been happy about the last third. So it's a great question, and it's one probably worth asking about. I'll say something seriously. It is a good scrutiny to apply to anything you read. How would the people who are represented in this feel about it? Because of course, people ask me that sometimes about Harper Lee, and I tried the whole time I was writing to think about how would the Reverend's family feel about this book, and how would the Radneys feel about this book? Because all too often, we can think about pleasing the most powerful or the people who have the most recourse for expressing their discontents. But when you're reading, coverage of these protests, think about how everyone involved feels. How do the authorities feel? How do the protesters feel? Is it doing justice to everyone's perspective? And I really did think sometimes kind of personally, how would I feel if someone were writing about my grandfather or about, my aunt? Because you tell the truth, but you don't let it hold you back from telling the truth, but you always want to be fair and respectful. And I think that, in that sense, I tried often to think about how everyone in the book would feel about it. And I'll just tell you, when I did the event in Alex City, I mentioned that Robert Burns came, but the truth of the matter is, one of the Reverend's daughters came, and a bunch of the Radneys came, and Jim Earnhardt, who's one of the reporters in the book, came. And so, if in case you didn't think this was nonfiction, everybody in the book who was still alive kind of walked off the page and were sitting in the room listening to me read and answer questions and talk about it. And I would like to think, even if none of them were happy, that they felt like I had tried to be fair to them all. So it's great to ask about Harper Lee, and I know she's probably the person who brings the most people to the story, but I stand by the kind of democratic structure of the book, which is these other people are just as interesting and have just as much to teach us about the world. And I think that biography rightfully looks at the lives of famous and powerful people, but I love the ways that the genre goes beyond that. So it's a great question, but I think everybody is important to think, oh, what would this old lawyer think of what she's done, and would he think it was fair, and even what would the serial killer think? Would he think she was fair, or that she'd gotten it right, or she'd taken liberties or anything like that? So thanks so much for asking that, though.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Gene. This was extraordinary. This was just a great time. I enjoyed every second of it. I think all of our viewers did as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. Of course, we know you would love to have your very own copy of Furious Hours. You can do that right now, right here, by clicking the link that we have in our description box below. That will take you right over to our partner and festival sponsor, Politics and Prose, where you can place your order. Food lovers, join us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. for a fun, lively, and informative interview about author George Zydan as he discusses his new book, Ingredients, The Strange Chemistry of What We Put in Us and on Us. Then, on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., we will feature a live presentation by award-winning and best-selling young adult author Linda Sue Park as she talks with us about her new book, Prairie Lotus. In the meantime, please feel free to look around the GBF YouTube channel and the festival website at Gaithersburgbookfestival.org to discover all the other amazing programs that we have coming your way. That's it, folks. Thanks for being here. I'm your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a terrific Friday evening, and we will see you tomorrow night. Keep reading.